So what I want to, I'm going to actually talk over some sound, if you don't mind. So what you're listening to is, and you'll begin to hear it, and it sounds like wild birds and frogs and cicadas and so on, but it's actually synthesized sound. And it was made for me by a musician when I was doing one of the projects that I want to talk about briefly as background to Watershed. And this is work that I originally did at Brown, and this is the greenhouse that was on the top of my building where my office was. And he made all these critter sounds that you could manipulate, and it would change by day or by night. So you'd get night sounding noises and day sounding noises, but all of this is done on an old analog computer. So this was one of in a series called Earth Itself, and Earth Itself was primarily a program that I did at Brown University on bringing the creative arts and humanities into discussions on climate change and the environment, because I was with the Institute on Environmental Studies, but also across the physical and biologics, life sciences. And the idea was to get people to engage around issues, not only within the university, but with other universities in the city of Providence, Rhode Island, and with civic players and with other academics. So, and that was somewhat helped because Brown is on a hill with beautiful land around it and old buildings, and down the bottom of the hill is Rhode Island School of Design. And that was very helpful in terms of people who might have had positions at RISD rather than at Brown University. The way I did it, because the brief was, we'll get the arts and humanities into issues around the environment, and that was all I had to do for 5 years. And so I used the elements as a way to think about that. So, and I'll come to that in a second, but the program actually each year included a library exhibition. It included poster presentations and a flash lecture series that I got PhD students to do, keynote addresses from some of the top climate science scholars and artists and humanities people in the US. We did installations and exhibitions. We had a film festival each year and various other activities. And the various other activities really depended on the particular art practice that I brought in. And the aim was to engage people in ways other than they would engage if, for example, they read an article about climate change, or they were studying geology or botany. So the first thing I did was that I took these elements and then I tied them to particular practices. So for Earth, which was a focus on stewardship and custodianship, I used dance, and so that's what you're looking at now. And the dance was wonderful because the entire dance performance, which was choreographed for the festival, was done on wet clay. So the dancers made imprints in the clay and wore the clay out and carried the clay everywhere. So it was a wonderful metaphor for thinking about the way in which we tread heavily on Earth. The second program was called Atmospheres. So that was around air. And the art practice that I engaged with was music / sound and acoustic ecology. So the sounds that I began this presentation with came from that. And then I worked with a number of acoustic ecologists across the US and Australia who were recording the environment, doing concerts using environmental sounds and so on. And then it also included a theatrical performance. The third year, so that's the sound again of one of the records. That's the Macritta sound. Okay, the third year was fire. This is 2017, and I used this sort of provocation of what fire does, because I didn't want to think of fire as destructive entirely, although I did have Stephen Pine, who's one of the world's top historians of fire, giving a keynote. But also I was looking at fire as productive, and in fact one could now think about fire as essential for the Anthropocene. So we could go right back and say, well, it isn't so much around industrialization, but around fire itself and how we use carbon to produce things, or produce carbon as we make goods. And in this, I worked with Rhode Island School of Design, and we had 2 weeks of lectures with fire art. So the top picture is from the glass blowing department at RISD, and they had a whole lot of students who work with glass doing a performance, and this was around heat, and then they went from that to making volcanoes out of glass as we were watching it. The bottom image is from a artist also at RISD who works largely in ceramics, where he was doing things with both baked clay, the pots, and then wet clay, which is this web with wet clay wrapped around it, which as it dried out, cracked and fell off. And again, the artists really engaged in the metaphors of the environment. The fourth year was Water's Edge, and I used mouth and voice and text for this program, for the arts component, and particularly for creative nonfiction writers and poets, as you can see there on the poster. And both this one and Atmospheres have resulted since in publication. So I've got a book coming out called Water's Edge next year, which involves a number of these people and other people who've written on water, and that includes water in all kinds of ways, from swimming holes to the ocean, to the drying out of water and rising sea, and so on. The final one I called Blue Sky. So I'd used my elements, and the whole point of Blue Sky is the notion of blue sky being to imagine a future. And it was really around, well, what is possible? And the whole intent was to capture a sense of hope and optimism, rather than to have Earth itself sit as a kind of rather despairing representation of the destruction of the environment and the warming of the world. And for this one, I used film particularly because of the ways in which people have used film, science fiction film, for example, as ways of imagining a future, positive or negative. Now, in the same year that I did Water's Edge, I also did a program in South Africa, which is Watershed. And the original intent was that I'd take one of these festivals to South Africa, and I didn't want to break the continuity at Brown. So I did one at Brown, and then I did another 2 weeks. So I did 4 weeks of festivals that year. And the one at Witwatersrand is called Watershed. And the title was very intentional in this respect. Johannesburg is has a very high elevation, and the university sits at the top of the city, in the center of the city, but at the highest point. And the Origins Museum and the engineering faculty and a number of other core buildings of the university sit at the very highest point, which is a watershed, so that the water that falls drains subterraneanly, either to the north and then out into the Atlantic Ocean, several thousand kilometers, or south and east into the Indian Ocean. So it was a literal watershed. That's the meaning of watershed. But it was also a watershed moment to think about art and science. And I've got elemental politics picking up the elements that I used in the Brown series. But also a watershed because it was the first time that the university had really built up collaboration between both arts and science, but what was literally at the point of the watershed, the dividing line between those two campuses, and really the theoretic sciences and the practical sciences. So it was a way of coming together between the East and West campus on the watershed. So everything was centered physically, although we actually took over much more than that part of the campus, and we also had work, exhibitions and performances and so on off campus. So what I'd like to do is to just show you a few things. And as you see there, we used artist academics, government administrators, we involved policymakers and people from civil society to talk about the challenges of climate in different ways, with the artists providing provocations from their work. And what I'm going to do is, let me begin with this. So this, what you're looking at is the foyer of the engineering building, and the engineering building, the central part is round. It's a huge big domed space, and which is about 3 stories high. And it was originally, it's the Chamber of Mines building. And we had an artist called Atul Bala, who's one of India's most important conceptual artists working on the environment. And basically, he took over the building, or this part of the building, and with the agreement, obviously, of the Dean of Engineering. And wonderfully, the Dean gave him carte blanche. And so he painted a whole lot of the stuff black, and then he surrounded, had a number of installations in this space, all of which center around Johannesburg's origins as a gold mining site and the destruction of the environment as a result of gold mining. So what I'm going to just briefly talk about is, firstly, these are screens, and there were 18 huge screens about 8 foot high, and I'll talk about that briefly. I'm going to talk about these, which are called Penduka, which is for mining. I'm going to talk about what went downstairs and what went upstairs, but well, very next slide, in fact, I'll do that. So the upstairs, which you can now see more closely here, is a mezzanine. And we use the mezzanine for receptions and dance performances and online streaming of some performance art. And I'll show you some of that momentarily. The large images of paintings that of prints that he had then used Photoshop in were scattered around the space. And then the curtain space, which you can sort of see it behind on the mezzanine area, those huge giant scrims, which people had to push apart to get into the central space. The patterns are from photographs of soil damaged with acid mine drainage. So when you mine, you produce, you use water, the water becomes contaminated, the contamination becomes this reddish color, and then when it's on the whitish soil, you end up with this kind of patterning. So that's what that is. The sharp metal at the bottom of this particular image, which was an area that used to be where students stood with their notebooks and so on and talked, is the kind of wire that protects buildings from outsiders. So it's a nasty reminder of sequestration in the city. And then the banners there, Atul did thousands of banners in both isiZulu and in English, which people could take and put on their bumper bars. And they were basically slogans about the warming climate and the destruction of the environment. The Penduka I said I'd mention, and this is dropped down the down into gold mines. And the gold mines, there are still gold mines underneath Johannesburg. thousands of them, many of them, all of them closed for commercial mining, but there are at any time thousands of people underground mining illegally, that is without permission, to get the last little bits of gold. And they use the penduka to pull up the gold or soil where they believe there is gold in it. Often people die underground. The ground collapses because it was abandoned by commercial miners many decades ago. And it really is a statement around poverty and how people make livings on the margins of what is legal or illegally. The gold on the penduka that you can see is actually gold leaf from India. And that's intentional because most of the gold that is mined illegally is then sold on and exported to India to use for gold leaf because it's not good enough for jewellery. And so Atul brought gold leaf back to South Africa for this work, and he bought the penduka from miners working underground, and he spent time with them. I've showed you an image, an arrow saying downstairs. Underneath that large open area is a thing called a digimine, which is a partly digitalized mine where students can go and look at what the conditions of a mine is like. Some of it is simulation and some of it is not so much digital, it's sort of literal mining. And the digimine people opened up the space for people to come downstairs and have tours and learn about what was going on. Half the campus had no idea there was a simulated mine on campus. But what was so interesting is that some of these people were students, and every day we got students coming downstairs who hadn't really gone down, or they were used to it for teaching and learning, but they hadn't thought about what they were looking at. And the exhibition above them in that big foyer really brought their attention to the fact that they were training to work in an industry that was degrading the environment and exploiting labour. So this is what acid mine drainage looks like. So it's a reddish yellow colour, and this is completely contaminated. You cannot use it for human and non-human life, and as you can see, also not plant life. The plants die with it. Another one of the artworks was some work by Brian House from the United States, and he went to a working mine and collected acid mine drainage. He went with students and staff from the university. So the university was implicated in all of this, right? And that was part of the point. And he collected the acid mine fluid, which is highly contaminated and dangerous, put it into these old chemical jars, and then you can see these old sound down the bottom from old boom boxes, and I'll let you have a listen to a bit later the sound that he was projecting. And this was again in a big open air area in the electronics centre in Johannesburg that is co-owned and run by Wits. And what he did was amplify the sound of chemicals leaching in the water and changing over time. So you start with water one colour, and then 3 weeks later it's changed again. And he amplified. You cannot, of course, hear molecules of water bounce around just by listening, but that's what he did. This is the work by Lucia Monge, who's Peruvian and who does mostly art performances around plants. But what she made was this fog catcher, and the inspiration are from fog catching plants in the Namakwa Desert, which is on the west of South Africa near to Namibia. And the point about that is these plants live in environments where there is almost no water at all, but the plants have adapted to be able to absorb fog in the atmosphere, and they survive on the fog. And then those little cups are around reflecting particular plants where leaves and so on capture tiny droplets of water in order to thrive. So we had that. This is work of a photographer. These are photographs of stains on rock, and these are rocks that have been dry for hundreds of years, but the stains are from water, and over time water, you know, the dropping of levels of water have left these unbelievable marks. This was a whole wall. So it looks small here, of course, on your screen, but you have to imagine that it was about 5 meters by 1.5 meters. So it was quite an impressive installation. This is work of a colleague and friend of mine, Christine Dixie from Rhodes University, who's an artist and whose work is in the Smithsonian Institute, amongst others, on Earth. And these were photographs that she had printed on brushed metal. And then there is a second layer. So you've got the brushed metal layer, and then the other layer is of bright blue perspex. So it's water. And then she drilled all these holes in it so you could see the bright blue through it. And what you're looking at are images from engineering drawings for fracking. And this is taken from the Peru where there is fracking. So it's really a fairly subtle argument against fracking, and her stated comments make it very clear what it's about. So just to give you a little closer look at it, it's quite extraordinary, including what is underground and then the way in which the earth cracks in order to access natural gas. So the next one, and I'm going to show you something in a moment from this, but I'll go through these slides and I'll show you the live stuff because I couldn't get them to work as I did the sound. So these are hyenas, and they're made from wood, found wood and other found bits and pieces by a friend, and Hanley Kutsia, who's a sculptor in South Africa, and now my privilege is a student of mine. And so Hanley made these hyena, and the point is that hyena follow the water course. So if you see a hyena, you know there's water nearby. So it's about animals' sense of environment and the way in which any animal uses an environment. Now, Hanley made an animation of the hyena, and I'd like to show, it's only a minute, so I'll show it to you in a moment. And that was on a loop, so that when people went into the gallery and saw these hyenas, it was the same gallery with Mark Lewis's photographs of water on stone and Lucia's fog catcher and Christine's work with the fracking. There was these hyenas, and then behind it was a video, and the stop frame was on a loop. Then the last piece that I want to show you, and again I want to show you very quickly a short clip of this, is a work called Pushing Against the Frame. You can see the man's shadow in there, which is Marcus Neustetter, and the ball of plastic is 2/3 full of water, so it weighs a massive amount. And as I said, most of the activities of the festival were on the Watershed. He had to push the ball up to the Watershed, and the duration of this was while we were having the opening reception of Watershed and talking about climate and drought. And at the same time, a number of cities in the country were still experiencing harsh drought and needing water brought in. Cape Town had had 2 years of drought. The day we opened, the taps went off and we had a water-free campus for the day. So that was not my intent, but I was more than pleased that somehow there was that magical alignment. As Marcus pushed this huge ball of water up the hill, the water leaked out. There was a couple of tiny holes. And so by the time he got to the top, the water had been lost on the road. And that was screened, so people watched that. And of course, the relevance of that was that he was demonstrating, I mean, pushing against the shed is pushing against the politics, amongst other things. Now, I want to show you, firstly, I showed you acid mine drainage, and that's familiar, right? And this is the sound of the water molecules, which I hope we're going to have streaming. Okay, so, and the point about that was simply the liveliness, the aliveness of toxic chemicals in water that would produce that sound if you amplified it, although for the most part we're entirely unaware of that. The second video I want to show you is the stop frame animation of the hyenas. And what happened was that Hunley decided it would be fun to take those wooden hyenas out of the gallery and let them walk across the watershed. So here they are, having a little walk. Just let me download it. And so these are the students going to and from their business, and there are the hyenas. I'll just move this up a little. There you are. You can see them in a second. They'll aren't they lovely? So this is a 2.5-minute video of the hyenas having a walk on a loop. Okay, so let me just hop out of that one. And then the last one I want to show you, and I'm going to show you a tiny bit longer, is the Marcus pushing the ball of water up the hill. So his sort of introduction is the futile attempt to push water against its natural flow in order to cross the line of the watershed of the University of Witwatersrand. So let me see if I can open that up. And this is Marcus. And so he started at peak hour traffic. I mean, it was in September. Well, it wasn't peak hour, it was a bit after that, but peak hour lasts a long time. And you can see he's a big man, he's well over 6 foot, so you can imagine how large this ball was. And you can see, because they've made this into a stop frame animation, that as he goes further and further uphill, the water's leaching out, and Marcus is getting more and more frustrated, trying to get it to the top and getting tireder and tireder, and putting it and dragging it. And there's a little trail of water you can see. And by the time he'd finished that, he was in, well, you can see he was in tears, by exhaustion and frustration. And it seemed always to me that it was entirely fitting that he would be so distressed by it. And we watched that while we were having drinks and nibbles for the opening. So that's what Watershed was about. And really it's an exercise in getting people to think about the issues through the power of arts performance and the work of artists. So I'm happy to take questions.
Oh, thank you so much, Leonore. That was really, really amazing. I think just from our breakout rooms, my breakout room that I was in, what we talked about for those 10 minutes was that it's so intangible, you know, and that there's so much science and data, and it kind of gets overwhelming. And I think what you've sort of shown with that project is how that can, you know, it comes to life. You know, we're not all scientists, we're not all naturally can look at a publication and sort of feel dread, but I think when you see those images like the acid and the hyenas, and you can automatically connect to that, and it's a really innovative way to do cross-disciplinary research. You know, that's what this group's about, to, you know, bridge the disciplines. But it's rare that we find a really amazing example of science and arts coming together to really drive home those messages in a way that you just sort of naturally connect to as a human, connecting to the arts and having those different all those different ways. I love the hyenas, and
lovely, aren't they?
Yeah, and I think that what the example that really drove home to me the point was the illegal mining, and just from that one object you could see that really opened people's eyes to like what was literally going on beneath their feet, and then obviously all the environmental.
I mean, the incredible thing about the mining and the literally beneath their feet, because it is literal, is that underneath Johannesburg, that whole hill on which it sits and the university sits, it's a honeycomb of mines, and the people who are doing, and they're mostly, I mean, they're unemployed. I mean, they're largely 18 to 20-year-old Zimbabwean kids who cross the border and come down to do the mining. And where they're mining, if you think about a honeycomb of mines, where are they getting the gold from if it's been mined out? The earth is held up with pillars. So the miners pull out soil, but they keep pillars to hold the earth up. But if the earth is on a whole lot of pillars and the miners are mining into the pillars, there's a point at which the pillars get very thin. So there's actually the risk that the whole city could collapse with the overmining of the earth on which we stand. And at the same time, the water that's used to wash and everything else is leaching acid into the environment and stuffing up the waterways and killing animals and everything else. And of course, this is a country where, you know, as Australia, where there is so much biodiversity that is under threat as well. But yeah, I mean, it was absolutely, you know, amazing to bring all those about. And I mean, what I showed you was simply, I guess, the most important works of art, but there was a lot of student art and there were other exhibitions. Sari.
Yes. Oh, I have a comment. It's just you get me. You're pushing my thinking. You're pushing my thinking with this thing. It's so rich with you know, about pushing the boundaries. You know, that across science and arts and humanity, and I can see that. This is my own reflection, that as academics, sometimes we are so privileged, and then we try to protect what we believe, the way we are doing things. Yeah, you know, this is the method, this is the way we are doing things, and often we are working in silo instead of trying to grab and understand history and what we believe as modernity, what we believe as technology. And in your presentation, I mean, with the work, actually is capturing how the history or historical abuse of the environment. I think that's, but for me, it's a lot of thinking, and it's a very eye-opening. And how that relate with the life of the animal, of the hyena, the human, the exit water, and also poverty. And how people living in the margin between legal and illegal way of making a living. So there's lots of things. I mean, so that's lots of thinking for me. But how then, what is next from here? you know, because we can argue that, okay, the artist presenting that, and that's their achievement, right? But what is it that relate to the, what's next after this?
Well, I mean, there's many what's next, isn't there? Because
yes,
this week and next week is part of the what's next, and this is a really important COP's Conference of the Parties, and the parties are signatories to the agreement to tackle climate change, and that's critical. Artists have always worked around and with COP. I was in Paris in 2015, partly for the Fringe, actually, which ended up not being severely constrained because there had been terrorism at the same time. But there is an art program that goes around that in some very dramatic artwork that has always been shown, and other people who produce art stimulated by these debates. So, and I don't think one can say, right, well, now what's next as a simple question, because climate change is, you know, what people refer to as a wicked problem. It's complex, deeply complex. And what I think the artwork of different kinds does is provoke people to think about it and to treat it seriously and to engage in their own way. But, you know, it's not about, oh, well, we'll now have an agreement and it'll all be over. It's an ongoing engagement. And I think that what's been so fabulous is that there was and there has been increasing concern globally. I mean, at present, so much is being published in Australia, for example, at present, that I'm reading around climate change and loss of biodiversity and the destruction of micro niches of biota and so on. Partly because, you know, people have stood still during COVID and had time to think about it, I think. And having spent 18 months talking COVID, we actually quite appreciate the space to be talking about other things as well. But I think that we have to be, I mean, voting for those of us who live in countries where you can vote and direct individual action. I mean, it actually matters that we walk rather than catch a car, for example. It matters that we don't support industries that we know to be truly destructive. I mean, we don't actually need plastic bags. So, you know, the fact that we had them was always around this notion of convenience, but it was only convenient for some people. So, you know, and I mean, and for me, what's been really extraordinary that does relate to the importance of where we are now is that 50 years ago, I was involved in a women's liberation group that was concerned with the environment. And we used to go in 1971 and 2 to the supermarket and unpack all of our food and leave them with the stuff we didn't want. So like the Wheat Bix came in a plastic bag that was inside a cardboard. We left the cardboard at Coles, and we did the same thing to anything else where you had goods that were inside a container in a container, and we left behind all the containers. And it infuriated the people in the supermarkets. And then what was so shocking is people forgot about that kind of direct action. Now, I'm not really saying let's all get back and start doing it again, though it wasn't a bad idea. I mean, the shock was that people got bored and stopped doing it. And what's so clear now is that we can't afford to stop doing the advocacy around environmental change. And that includes things like governments. This government where I am at present has got to start reducing the tax on electric vehicles so people stop using fossil fuel vehicles. And you know what some of the wins are, you could say fossil fuel, not everybody could define it, but everybody knows the term. And so there is an increase of literacy, I think, globally. And then we have to be working with other governments that are struggling. But I have to say that the most exciting changes and the greatest foresight are with some of the poorest countries in the world. I mean, South Africa's had wind power investment programs for as long as I can remember. I mean, they didn't need convincing, even though they're dependent on coal mining for a lot of energy. There's still an awareness that this had to be a short-term strategy, and the quicker you got out of it, the quicker you'd find jobs. And in a country with 50% of unemployment, then it kind of, in some areas, it makes great sense to find new ways for people to be working. So, I mean, it is all of that. It's about keeping climate change on a political agenda, but taking action at the same time.
Thank you, Lenore. I want to thank you for this really insightful and very inspiring presentation. I thought I just unmute myself because I had a question. Do you have an example of those, over the years that you have all these exhibitions and installations and art performances, that you really saw a change or an influencing or changing policies in a case that you had? For example, the mining that you see over those years with all those installations going on, we really saw a specific change happening on a certain topic in that area or in that place?
Well, no, I mean, I think that would be asking too much of one small intervention, right? I mean, I'm talking about up to 2 weeks, but only up to 2 weeks of art in one place, without then following it up and in, you know, you can't change that quickly.
Yeah.
But what I do think is that still people at Fits in Engineering talk about Watershed, and now include teaching their students about the risks of illegal mining, but why people mine illegally and the risks to their lives, and see it now as an equity issue. And the man who runs the DigiMine took all of those giant scrims for downstairs so he could talk about what acid mine drainage looked like. And, you know, if all I do is change the attitudes of a few people, it seems to me that's okay. You know, I mean, I think one has to, you know, none of us can make huge policy impact. But anybody who was involved was touched and thoughtful, and all the people that were involved in that and more are still involved. So, for example, the exhibition area was in the Origins Museum, and we've been talking about doing a series of seminars over the next year around art, science, rocks, and and geology and biodiversity and everything else there. So it kept the interest going, and I think that's really important.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for answering that.
Mandy?
Yes, thank you. Let me just get my hand down. I really enjoyed your presentation and how you presented it, and I felt lucky to be able to experience the art, even though I'm not there. So I quite enjoy it, even though it is a not necessary. It's a disturbing topic in some ways, but the art was really enjoyable and made you think. So a question I have is actually about related to the art. Did you incorporate smell at all into, or did your artists or whom you worked before just smell into these artistic environments, or do you have a plan to do so in the future? As far as like mines, I was thinking in my head as I was thinking of these images, just wondering, okay, being there as a person, what would this smell like? So I'm just interested.
Yes, no, and the quick answer is no, we didn't. And smell was a sense that didn't align with a particular element and got left out. It's an interesting question, because one could work with the chemistry department with students to replicate particular smells, and that would be really productive. I mean, I think that what's relevant is with all of these programs, the Earth Itself at Brown as well as Watershed, was that none of it could have occurred without collaboration across disciplines. I think money would have stood in the way, Mandy, for some of that, but I think it's a really, really good idea and an interesting thing. And smell has been used in museums quite a bit to sort of replicate past and particular environments. And it would be really interesting to sort of push that further. But I mean, the collaborations that did occur were really incredible, not the least of which is because no one charged. They just all got behind it and decided this would be a good idea and ran with it. And I think, to go back to that earlier Berta's question around change, I mean, the fact that engineering and chemistry departments and others all thought it was a good idea to be involved in an art exhibition with a series of academic panels from historians and anthropologists says a lot about, you know, that one can actually move beyond the rhetoric of interdisciplinarity and start doing things that are exciting and that everyone's engaged in and that actually doesn't really cost much and is fabulous in terms of learning.
Yeah.
Yeah, I felt engaged just being here, sitting at home. So I appreciate your presentation. And
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm going to follow up and excited about your book as well. So I'll let
download your book.
What I'll do, because there are a few articles around, well, one on a special issue of Contemporary Music Review for Atmosphere, and a special issue of Leonardo on Watershed and some other stuff. I'll share with Sari to share with you all, if that's okay, Sari.
Yes, sure.
A bundle of material and the URLs for the various video clips I showed you. And then
your
of course, as you know, the book was in the chat, but I'll share some other URLs because I think almost everything I've written in the last year on COVID is free for download, which is also a great win, you know, including, I have to tell you, the book in the first 2 weeks had nearly 2,000 downloads from 88 countries. Who knew there were 88 anthropologists or people in 88 countries that wanted to hear anthropology voices?
Lenore, I have a question. So yes. Because do you think because you make it locally, you know, like the locality, because you tell about the history of this university being top of the hill, and then there was the mining around it. So because you try to make it local rather than removing the art exhibition somewhere there, but you use the building. Do you think that has a more like emotional or psychological impact and connection with people?
Yeah, I mean, the actual mines are not right around the university. I mean, they're now, the nearest mine is now probably 50 kilometers away. But obviously, well, I think because it was like a festival of ideas, so it has to be local, you know, and that includes, you know, all of the art performances for all of the work. So the stuff at Brown as well. And I'll just give another little example actually around the local. One of the things we did with Atmospheres was bird walks at 6 o'clock in the morning. People gathered outside the building where my office is and walked around the precinct of Brown University, which is not particularly bushy. And we had one person who is an ardent bird watcher, and everybody was transformed because he'd say, don't look, just listen. And even those of us who thought we weren't all that good at listening could suddenly hear all these birds that we normally walk through going to work and ignore. I think, I mean, your more interesting point, or the broader point, Sari, is that, I mean, that's why artists go to COP. You know, COP is not, people who are at COP now are not going to go around the world in search of art on the environment. I mean, you have to go to them. And some places I think have really good traditions around public art and the importance of public art. And that includes site-specific performances, which is really what you were looking at from all of the things that I did, and more permanent public art and what that does. And it's certainly, you know, a more enduring form of commentary than having an advertising campaign, for example, on use less plastics, right? I mean, there's just something tangibly different that captures the imagination.
I really love the metaphors, you know, the emotion, that the capture of the human emotion, and then, you know, carrying this one. There's another comment here, very symbolic, the struggle to get the water up the hill against the natural flow.
Yeah, I know.
After seeing the result from the floods in the South Island, water flow follows in own path in the end. Yeah.
Shabnam.
Shabnam.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My background is nutrition, so no relation to the art, and I don't have any art skill really, but I was just thinking what you presented, the interpretation of what I was saying, it was very similar to other people here, at least in this online room. However, we know that in art exhibitions, people can get their own conception and understanding from what they are seeing from that piece of art. But what it has been presented so far, it seems that it's coming to a very mutual understanding about the climate change, about what we are going to face. So I'm thinking that to take this to another level, is that possible to capture audience of those exhibitions before and after visiting those arts, to see that what did they understand? And that can be a kind of a reflection to some of the policymakers that although art can have different meanings for different people, but for some topics like climate changes, there is no other interpretation. We are all talking about one thing.
Well, accepting, unfortunately. I mean, there are some people who would question that as propaganda. You know, you think of America's former president. I mean, he wouldn't be touched by it other than to think, oh, there's still gold under the city. Terrific. You know, we can get rid of the city and leach out all the gold as well. Lucky me. You know, I mean, we didn't do exit interviews. I have no idea how people read it. You got my enthusiastic revisiting of it, and clearly it affected people who went there. But you know, at one level, art is didactic. I mean, some of the art in addition to some of the works I showed you at Brown, there were lots of other artwork, and some of it was more or less didactic. Some of it clearly doesn't affect anyone. And, you know, we had huge photographs on buildings of the sort of iconic photos of ice melting in the Arctic. Did that change American policy at all? No. Did it even change some of the people in the city who walked past that? Probably not. They just thought, oh, nice icebergs. And I think it is a challenge, but I also think that that doesn't matter, and that some people who are affected is enough. And I guess that, I mean, partly, it almost wouldn't matter if it wasn't, it didn't have a message as well. You know, I mean, I enjoy the creative arts as a viewer, not as an art maker, but the more one finds opportunities to do that, then the more people may. I mean, it's a reinforcer as much as as a way of opening people's eyes, and I think that's true for other things too. And so there's been, I mean, another example would be the powerful work globally being done by artists on slavery, and in South Africa, lots of stuff on the slave ships. And some of it's controversial. There are always debates about enslavement and different countries' experiences of it. But you know, the works of art are provocative, and that's their value.
Thank you for that. And I do agree that all those changes they need to happen at multi-sectorial, and it's not very easy to get the policymakers' attention with a single message. So having passed that message through different channels, through art, through public health, through, you know, all different science channels, it will end somewhere that we are all hoping.
Well, indeed. I think that's how one does maintain one's hope, and rather than be overwhelmed by the enormity of the problems that we face as a globe, and then give up. And it's not an option to give up. But it's a terror that, you know, there's intermittently this terrible sense of the responsibility that we now all face, more so from my generation than any of your generation, but still, you know, it is everyone's responsibility now, including to put pressure and to point out whose responsibility it was in the first place, without, you know, then laying blame. And I do think actually that my point that I'd made around, you know, the use of fire being the precedent to industrialization and therefore the beginning of the Anthropocene is really clever of me. So we've now got the Pyrocene.
True, that's right. Thank you very much.
Okay. All right. No further questions, Sari?
No, but Elid will read some of the comments on the screen in the chat.
I don't know whether you got a chance to. There weren't questions, but lots of appreciation for your work in the chat, Lenore.
Thank you.
Let me just see if I don't want to miss any.
I can read. Yeah, I think this one from Eleanor. Such an important and timely presentation. Great to see all of coming together to share new creative ways, sectors, and disciplines to unite, disrupt, and gain momentum. So yeah, and she had to leave. And then our Dean, thank you so much for such a thought-provoking presentation. Demonstrates the power of transdisciplinary approaches. I'm afraid, yeah, they have to go to another meeting. And then thank you, really enjoyed the laugh. I love the hyenas. My apologies, I have another meeting, and then very symbolic struggle to get the water up the hill. And then the discussion, integration of art and science through collaboration of this exhibition. Appreciative the sharing. Yeah.
Grace said, amazing and extraordinary. I'm glad that I had this opportunity. And thank you for the presentation. I enjoyed the artwork and the integration of art and sciences through collaboration. Thank you for sharing. I'm grateful for the creative people out there. But
well,
yeah,
thank you, and thank you for inviting me and for allowing me to fly over to Auckland to meet you all.
Yes.
And I look forward to the meal that we're going to have straight after this.
Yeah.
Sometime, people, it will happen. But I mean, there's another lesson, Shabnam, with caution, because some of us probably used up too much carbon flying around the world until now.
Yeah.
There is silver linings to COVID, isn't there?
And we have your book, Viral Load, you know, people can download for free.
Yeah, no, I'll
want to reach 30,000, eh? Yeah.
Oh no, that's not the book for 30,000. That's the article. Sorry.
Oh, the article's
got the book. The book. Look, if we have 3,000 downloads by the end of the year, I'll be happy. But it may well go beyond that.
Okay.
Thank you so much for having me. I really
thank you so much, Lenore. Lots of love.
Okay.
I'll catch up with you later.
Yes,
thank you.
Thank
Wonderful.
Bye bye, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.